The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Nelson Lichtenstein on the link between antitrust advocacy and the movement to unionize workers. Martin Halliwell on how America responds to health crises and what needs to change. Plus, Bill Press with Larry Sabato on how Republicans are positioned for success in 2022 and what Democrats can do about it. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In the wake of the recent failure to unionize workers at the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer, Alabama, labor historian Nelson Lichtenstein explains how the current antitrust revival has the potential to prevent similar failures and advance unionization at Amazon and other giant corporations. And we say hello to Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He's also the author of 16 books, including State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson Lichtenstein, thanks very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Glad to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote a piece for The Nation titled, What Next for Amazon Workers? And you described the failure to unionize Amazon workers at the Bessemer plant in Alabama in April as more a confirmation of Amazon's power than an indication of the willingness of its employees to organize for collective action. What gave Amazon the upper hand in this campaign?
Well, it's over the years, there have been so much transformation of the labor law in a direction toward helping employers and Amazon is such a large and sophisticated company that it was sort of overdetermined that they would win. And I think the enormous attention that was paid to this campaign in the media and elsewhere came away from the sense that this was not like, oh, the workers decided they didn't want a union. What came out of it was that the various tools that Amazon had, everything from captive audience meetings where workers are forced to attend anti-union talks, to the way in which Amazon tried to keep workers away from handing out leaflets, all sorts of things. We could go on for hours about that. The net result was that people came away from that. I think the general public was, Amazon has too much power, as do many of the other tech companies, and it's sort of the playing field was tilted so heavily against the workers that it's not a surprise that they lost.
Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the next step, you suggest that a revival of antitrust advocacy could work in organized labor's interest. First, where are we seeing this advocacy being expressed, and why now?
Well, we are seeing it. It's been taking place for a few years now, but recently President Biden just made it absolutely formal. He appointed a 32-year-old associate professor of law from Columbia, Lina Khan, to head the Federal Trade Commission, and she wrote a path-breaking article called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. I'll get to that in a second. And so she's has the official position of in charge of antitrust in the United States government, which is quite remarkable. And then there are other people as well in the Biden administration who have this who see antitrust as important. Now, here's the way it links to labor, and I think this is where a little history is appropriate. In the late 19th century, in the Gilded Age, and then in the early 20th century, and the idea of antitrust, breaking up the big, monopolies, the steel trust or the meat patent trust, et cetera. These trusts were kind of quasi-monopolies, was linked not to lower prices. Although it's true, Rockefeller kept the price of oil up, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was these big companies had too much power, raw power to corrupt the Senate, power over their workers, power to fleece farmers, and that was part of the world of the populists and the progressives and the New Dealers as well. That antitrust was seen as, or as a way of cutting back the power of private industry that was sort of we just had too wealthy, too much power, etc. There's also the issue was that many of these companies, and not just electric utilities, for example, or telephone companies 100 years ago, they were utilities. That is, everyone had to, they provided a service that was essential for everyone, railroads, for example, clean water, etc. And therefore, they were properly subject to government regulation. So that was 100 years ago. Now, what happened in the meantime, especially from the 1950s and 60s on, was that antitrust became narrowed down, became a very technical question, was mainly, the issue was, are the prices too high? If a big company, is able to lower prices, okay, no problem. Robert Bork, you may remember him. He was the conservative nominee to the Supreme Court who didn't make it. But Bork was a theorist and advocate of this point of view, and it flourished in the 1980s and really in the 90s under Clinton and continuing. That the idea being that the only criteria for worrying about bigness is the price too high? Well, Amazon does in fact, and Walmart, for example, another example, they have low prices. So on that criteria, no problem. Amazon is fine. They have low prices. Don't worry. What's your problem with them? But obviously, I think the Bessemer situation and others have shown that they have this power, this political, economic power, which is not just a question of consumer welfare, but worker welfare and just community welfare, et cetera. And so this issue, which again, 100 years ago, antitrust was linked to the rights of labor. I think that's happening again today, and I think that issue is on the agenda, as it were, right now. And Linda Kahn, the new head of the Federal Trade Commission, in her extensive writings about Amazon, makes that point directly.
Mm-hmm. It was funny as you were talking about, these big companies are keeping the prices down. So what's your problem? It kind of reminds me of the, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Right.
As you write in the article, this isn't the first time there's been an antitrust movement in the United States. How does this moment compare to the impulse and vision of that history?
Well, I think today it's just getting started again, and I just saw a article in the paper that all the tech companies and Amazon are mobilizing an army of lawyers to fight the contemporary efforts to curb them. But back in the 30s, let's say the 30s and the progressive era, 1930s, the New Deal, Roosevelt himself. And Biden has as well made the argument that, the big companies, have too much power. It wasn't just that prices are too high, but they have too much power. And one incident that I like to reference is this, that back in the 30s, the chain stores were a new phenomenon, and they were very big, and lots of people didn't like them. Chain stores were not unlike, tech. A&P had 15,000 little stores, putting all sorts of small proprietors out of business. And and there was a lot of agitation in Congress and elsewhere to break up the chain stores, the same way that today breaking up tech. And so A&P, which was the largest in those days and really gigantic, was subject to that critique? Well, it's complicated, but they cut a deal essentially with the unions, and the unions, they agreed, we'll allow you, we'll stop resisting unionization of A&P in return for which the unions would sort of at least not be part of this breaking up A&P or curbing it. And I think that was a good deal in this way, that one place where unionism and high wages and good conditions flourish is when wages are taken out of competition. When you do, in fact, have big business, but which is unionized and regulated. So, example, the big auto companies back in the 1950s and 60s, they set the pace for good wages and more unionization. And the same would be true of, say, electrical utilities or railroads when they were flourishing. They're kind of monopolies. They're kind of utilities. They're regulated, and that means wages are taken out of competition, and so unionism can flourish. Well, I think the other aspect of contemporary thinking about big tech and other companies is Google and Facebook and Amazon. These are really utilities. They're utilities. They're like the electric company. They're like the water system. Everyone, you have to have it. I mean, you can't live without plugging into Google. And so therefore they are properly to be regulated. And if they're to be regulated, then all sorts of things can come under regulation. And they're already monopolies in effect. So why have $15, have $30 wages at Amazon, or et cetera? So I think that dynamic is on the table, and I think it can be pushed forward today.
We're speaking to Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, where he directs the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy, and also the author of, among many books, State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson, you also write that breaking up big companies such as Amazon would actually do little to advance unionization, while the threat of antitrust action could. What led you to this conclusion?
Yeah, well, right. Well, a couple of things. Well, these companies are so gigantic that you cut them in half, they're still gigantic. I mean, you don't solve that problem. They're still huge. You cut them in thirds, they're still gigantic. So that's one part of it. The second is that I think the threat that is the business model of these companies. They're very this is the key thing, and we've seen this with Uber and Lyft. The effort in California and other places to really regulate them and to establish some standards on a statewide basis, and then just sent them ballistic, and they actually put all this money into a referendum, which ended up negating what the legislature wanted to do. But we can see there that their business model was actually crucial, and if you can threaten that, then you can really put the fear of God into some of these big companies, and then unionization or doubling their wages is the lesser evil. It's the lesser evil than the regulation you might want. And so actually, and in fact, Uber and Lyft have been, I think, in a bad way, have been making overtures to labor for various things. We'll set up some union or something like that. They aren't very good deals they put forward thus far, but nevertheless they've been doing that, and that alone shows me that they want to preserve their business model at all costs. And in some cases, I think that's a good idea. In other cases, not. I think with Uber and Lyft, their business model is so rotten, I think we should just destroy it. But that's not the case of Google or Facebook. I mean, I think regulation is appropriate there.
This almost sounds like history repeating itself from what you said earlier about 100 years ago, where it's kind of here's the deal that we can give you because this is the lesser of two evils.
We live in a capitalist society, and there's some things remain the same. They just because you have a exciting piece of iPad in front of you doesn't mean that certain principles don't apply. And I think that yes, when unionization does surge forward, and it does periodically, every 2 or 3 generations, it's because companies see it as the lesser evil. They see it as the alternative is well, revolution or chaos or something of that sort. And so, and unions, in fact, this is what industrial relations people used to say, and it's still true in some places like Canada and some parts of Europe. Unionism is a stabilizing force. It takes certain issues out of contention and regularizes and routinizes other kinds of conflict.
Do you have a sense that labor organizers already understand this dynamic and how they can build this into their strategy?
Well, to a degree. I mean, labor is in such on the defensive, and they're scrambling so hard to just keep up with what's happening that it's hard for them to be strategic. But I think, yes, in some circles, unquestionably, and this is being debated to a degree. There's a debate going on actually in the on pages of some magazines, The Nation among them. Should these big tech be completely broken up? Should labor? Just what I've been saying is sort of subject to debate. So I think there is a debate going on. I wouldn't say it's the main focus that labor is pushing today. That's not the case. But I think they're aware of this issue. Yes.
Now, before we end, I think we should recognize the development in the campaign to unionize Amazon workers. The Teamsters have now taken this on. Do you have a sense that this will actually mean something for workers?
Well, the Teamsters are a bigger union. They do have more resources than the retail clerks who tried last time. It doesn't necessarily. I mean, the Teamsters have a reputation of guys are tough guys and all that, but they've lost their share of battles as well. So I think it's good that this union is deciding to put some resources into this. If anything, it means that it keeps Amazon on their toes, and they'll incrementally improve conditions so as to avoid unionization. Whether it certainly is not a sure thing. There's no sure thing. The biggest union in the country, the SEIU or the AFT, when they decide to have a campaign, it doesn't mean at all they're going to succeed. There's the phrase "big labor," which is bandied about. It doesn't exist really. Even the biggest trade union is not powerful compared to the larger corporations or other institutions of that sort. So yes, I'm glad they're doing it, and it will keep Amazon on their toes. That's for sure.
And David and Goliath will continue to live on as a story in the business world, I guess.
Unions have always they need the state on their side, and they had it in the 1930s and to a degree in the 1960s. And I think it's time now for the state to weigh in on the side of labor. And Biden, is aware of that.
Nelson Lichtenstein, distinguished professor in the Department of History at UCSB, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast, his latest book, or State of the Union, A Century of American Labor. Nelson, we appreciate your time with us today and would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, breaking the cycle of failures and how America responds to health crises. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Our local newspapers are being merged, purged, shrunk, shut down, and looted by Wall Street profiteers. Yet, there's good news. In the towns those media vultures are torching, a phoenix is rising. Hundreds of determined locals, often led by people of color, are finding new ways to pay for and revive top-quality local journalism. For example, the Ferndale Enterprise moved to an old Victorian home, renting upstairs rooms to vacationers to subsidize the paper. Also, while aloof Wall Street owners have no connection to us or our towns, the scrappy new community papers are stressing their grassroots connection by moving into friendlier, more central, street-level spaces such as public libraries and community centers so that regular people can see them and have direct access to their reporters and editors. Then there's the editor of the Sahan Journal in Minneapolis, who moves his weekly editorial meeting to the offices of various grassroots groups so their members can help shape the paper's coverage. And in Marfa, Texas, the Big Bend Sentinel is literally serving the public, not only with a good weekly, but also with the Sentinel, a combo coffee shop, cozy bar, cafe, event space, and hangout for locals to meet and greet. In ways big and small, dedicated local journalists are experimenting with funding, structure, staffing, etc. to produce the news that democracy requires. Note to Wall Street vultures, these newspaper ventures aren't interested in scaling up to maximize investor profits. As they know, it was corporate cost-cutting, consolidation, and scaling that got us into today's mess of journalistic collapse. And, unlike the Wall Street model, their success is not measured simply by financial return, but also by how they do at keeping citizens informed and engaged. This is Jim Hightower saying, now that's real journalism. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Martin Halliwell's most recent book covers a century of public health governance and where it has fallen short reacting to crises such as COVID-19. He calls for a new kind of public health culture that can be more resilient in the face of future crises. And we say hello to Martin Halliwell, Professor of American Studies at the University of Leicester. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Jim.
Well, absolutely. Our pleasure to have you with us. And your book, American Health Crisis, 100 Years of Panic, Planning, and Politics, it's about how the U.S. government has responded to health crises over the past century and what we can learn, of course, from that history. Your starting point is 1918, when Woodrow Wilson was president. Why did you choose that as a place to begin?
Well, there was a number of health crises or emerging health crises that Wilson was being forced to deal with in around 1916 to 18. Think about inner city poverty and illnesses that were associated with that, venereal disease in the US Army, the illicit spread of opiates across society, and obviously the great influenza pandemic, which hit in spring 1918, although it wasn't really publicized by the government or the media until that autumn. So there were a number of colliding crises in 1918, which gave it a really nice starting point. And also, I think when I was first designing the book, I was going to end in 2018. At the time I was starting to write it, the opioid crisis was starting to crest towards the end of the Obama administration. And the plan was and it's the last case study in the book, was to end with the opioid crisis to mirror that government concern in the 1910s. But of course, COVID happened, and you'll see both in terms of one of the chapters on viruses, but also in the coda of the book, the COVID-19 crisis had to be dealt with. So that gives you a sense of why I saw my century being 1918 to 2018. But of course, COVID had its own rules, and I've tried to bring it up as much as I can to the present day. Of course, there's always a problem dealing with contemporary history, and we can talk later, if you like, about COVID and how that changed the arc of the book.
Absolutely. We will talk about that in just a bit. But one of the points you make, Martin, is that the United States encounters health crises more than many other nations. Why is this the case?
Well, it's very interesting, and I think we can look at it from a few different perspectives. One would be about the language of health crisis, which kept cropping up through the 100 years that the book charts. I was taken by a quotation from Naomi Klein, the Canadian leftist thinker, speaking in 2017. She says, "Ours is an age when it has become impossible to pry one crisis apart from all the others. They have all merged, reinforcing and deepening each other." She's speaking about contemporary crises, but I use that quotation as a leitmotif for thinking about how the language of crisis has maintained a particular pitch through the 100 years. Sometimes it's aligned with the notion of a public health emergency, whether that's on a global scale or nationally. But sometimes the pitch of a crisis is in tension with the idea of something that is an emergency that needs to be dealt with there and then, because crisis seems to overlap and submerge particular episodes into one continuous narrative, if you like. Another way of thinking about crises in the US would be the development of the US Public Health Service, which was established in the early Republic to provide aid for sick seamen. There were a number of crises in the late 19th century: TB, yellow fever, earlier waves of influenza. But it seems it's the vastness of the nation, both in terms of its geography and climate, but also the idea of having a health system that speaks to all Americans across the 50 states and allied territories. It seems that crises have sped up in recent years, though, perhaps since the 1970s, when it seems that natural disasters, which typically have a human hand behind them, have become increasingly prevalent. We think about fires in California and hurricanes in recent years. But also, I think the health system itself, from an economic perspective, but also an organizational one, seems to be increasingly under strain. In terms of crises happening in other countries, I'm not making an exceptional case for the US, but if you look to Canada or Europe in terms of the system, there tends to be a safety net, a government-backed safety net, which is clearly different in the US, where it's a piecemeal system with private and public and government-led elements to it. So the book itself deals with what I call geographies of vulnerability, so thinking about climate and the environment, but also the idea of vulnerabilities inbuilt in a system, so thinking about healthcare as a system, which is sometimes, in tension with the idea of a public health culture, which is about community and individuals, which is sometimes, a different kind of language to that of a system.
Sure. Well, another thing is one of the first decisions a government has to make when a health crisis emerges is whether to intervene at all. And as you point out, the United States has often been reluctant. What would drive such a decision, and what's the cost?
I'll come back to cost. One of the things I try and do in the book is not to avoid thinking about the economics of healthcare, but to try and tell a broader story, because in Congress, it seems that economics and budgets dominate the whole scenario. The idea of public health sometimes disappears when we're thinking about budgets and economics. It's worth saying that the first case study in the book, so the first chapter is on floods, and I look at the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, which affected a big swathe of the Plains states down to the Delta, so from Illinois down to Louisiana. But President Coolidge, who was in the White House at the time, was reluctant to step in straight away. And looking at the historical record, it seems that Coolidge was concerned not necessarily about the finance, but about setting a precedent that if he did that, then every president or every administration afterwards would have to do the same. So Coolidge never went to the South. He sent Herbert Hoover, who was his Commerce Secretary, to work with the Red Cross in southern states to provide aid and to think about how to get out of the crisis moment. More contemporary examples, we could think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 or Hurricane Maria in 2017, when the George W. Bush and Trump administrations were very slow to respond, particularly Trump. We saw him in San Juan. He didn't go to anywhere else in Puerto Rico in 2017. And everyone remembers the image of the Bush flyover New Orleans. It's interesting, though, that often crises, although we can never prevent a crisis happening, I think the language of planning and prevention is sometimes not where we are. We're on crisis prevention in terms of how we intervene, how we stop the crisis mounting in the moment, rather than thinking more proactively and with historical parallels in mind. So Bush in May 2005 was talking about the importance of planning ahead and securing our homes in advance of storms. But then he didn't talk about Katrina until 2 days after the hurricane had hit New Orleans. And when he did talk about it, it was in terms of a temporary disruption and a mopping up procedure, rather than the focus on lives and livelihoods. So to come back to cost.
Well, and there's another cost right there, is the human toll.
Sure, absolutely. And that's sometimes hard to put a figure to. Obviously, it's easier to do it in terms of property damage or damage in a material sense. The idea of putting a dollar bill to the cost of a life or a community is much harder to do. When it is in terms of intervention, crisis intervention, I think practical steps need to be done to evacuate a disaster zone. Careful coordination at all levels is needed, but also outreach in communities well after the disaster hits. But I think more than that, the idea, and I keep going back to this in the book, the idea of a public health culture, which is owned at least partly by the community, which can help it be more resilient in the face of future crises. The book is about agency in some ways, and the idea of a crisis hitting a community and it lacking the resources to help itself or to help the members of that community is something that I try and deal with in the book.
We're speaking to Martin Halliwell, professor of American Studies at the University of Leicester, also the author of American Health Crisis, 100 Years of Panic, Planning, and Politics. And Martin, a central theme of your book is that marginalized populations throughout U.S. history are the most at risk during a health crisis. You identify geography as a factor, as well as more systemic factors. Over time, what are some of the built-in aspects of the American public health system that have failed these marginalized communities during a crisis?
Sure. I mean, that's a broad question. I'll try and give it some thought in my comments, but it's a question I deal with throughout the book. And obviously issues around racial justice and environmental justice that have come to light in the last couple of years really sharpen the idea that President Biden talks about colliding crises at the moment, those being two of them, as well as the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis. So sometimes we have to deal with aspects in terms of an ecology, interconnected series of factors, rather than something that can be easily separated out. But it's interesting that the National Institutes of Health added a new institute in 2010, which focused on minority health and health disparities that had been routinely overlooked in the century prior to that. And race is a really important aspect there, of course, when we think about the reality of segregation in hospitals up to the mid-1960s, but also forms of soft segregation as well in terms of zoning of neighborhoods and access to healthcare facilities, whether it's in an urban inner city community or a rural out of the way community. I think access to facilities and quality healthcare is always an issue when we're thinking about underserved communities. Another form of exclusion would be the idea that the modern healthcare system in the US is heavily bureaucratic, but also it speaks in dialogue with the pharmaceutical industry, etc. I think one difference between UK and US healthcare, apart from the government-backed side of it, would be that doctors are relatively reluctant in the UK to prescribe antibiotics or other forms of medication. It's not often the first thing that is done, where it's less like that in the US. But if we think about, sometimes there are language barriers to healthcare. If we think about the Latinx community, and sometimes we're thinking about American Indian health, the idea that a modern bureaucratic health system is sometimes in deep tension with the notion of traditional health and traditional healing. The last point I'd make would be my work on mental health, which is really the work I've done most on, and some other projects that preceded this gave me a real insight into not just federal responses to mental health crises, but the way in which mental health has often been part of that language of exclusion, whether it's in terms of insurance or whether it's an invisible crisis that doesn't reveal itself until quite late in the day. And what I try and do, particularly in the 5th chapter of the book on care, is to think about what care is. Is it about control? Is it about custodial care? Or again, is it about a community having some of the resources and some of the insights in order to come up or partially come up with its own solutions? So community care, which was a major factor of the Johnson administration in the 1960s in terms of community health services, is something that the book takes very seriously. And I think, whichever country we're in, we need to take seriously today in light of COVID and other crises that we're facing.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned COVID. Let's turn to the present moment. It is easy to see the echoes of history and how our government responded to COVID-19. But is there anything about this crisis that stands out to you as unique?
There are a few things. The 4th chapter of the book, I look at 3 viruses. I look at the influenza pandemic 1918-19, which I've spoken about earlier. I look at the polio epidemic, which restarts in the late 19th century and goes through to the 1950s in a series of episodes that hit various cities around the country. But I think it's the vaccine rollout of the polio vaccine in the 50s that really caught my attention. And obviously there are parallels there in terms of vaccine rollout at the moment for COVID. And then the 3rd case study, I look at the AIDS pandemic. And I think if we're thinking about marginalized communities and the stigma that's often attached to them, there's parallels there between the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the kind of stigma that's been thrown around by the previous president and others when it comes to COVID. But in terms of differences, I think the high level of transmissibility of COVID-19 is clearly the one thing that sets it aside from other viruses that we've encountered recently as well as historically. And also its mutability as well. I was reading the other day that the World Health Organization has renamed the various strains of COVID that have emerged over the last few months using the codes alpha, beta, delta, and gamma, so as not to call them the UK strain or the Indian strain or the South African strain, to try and get rid of that language of stigma that's quite obvious when we attach it to a place. So I think transmissibility and mutability are the key things that I think set it apart from previous pandemics.
Of course, we're always supposed to learn from our history and from our past mistakes and things. But in terms of what can stop the United States from repeating those same mistakes over and over again, you advocate for the idea of health citizenship. How do you define this idea, and how can it play a role in building a better public health response to health crises?
Yeah, so health citizenship is one of I think there are three major themes in the book. History and what we can learn from history is the first. The second, that theme of vulnerability I've spoken about. And the third is health citizenship. There's always a danger with talking about communities seeking their own solutions, that we kind of give the government a free pass, or authorities that, that communities will step in and help themselves when there's a void. And one thing I try and deal with in the book is the issue of leadership, and the way in which leaders sometimes hide motives, and other times, either swerve towards everything's under control, or even swerve in the opposite direction towards panic. And we've seen with leaders like Anthony Fauci, who was important in the HIV/AIDS years as much as today, that he emphasizes what's known, but also is honest about what's not known, what we don't know at the moment. And that sometimes health advice of 6 months ago will change or will evolve as more things are known. But health citizenship on the community level, I think there's a danger talking about citizenship. I noticed that one of your podcasts recently is on citizenship stripping, and there's questions of citizenship in terms of inclusion and exclusion, particularly in the world of health and healthcare, because it raises questions about what kind of responsibility we have over our own health, and what are the limits of state responsibility in caring for its citizens. But nevertheless, I see health citizenship as a way of transforming what I call the public health culture into a community resource that's not simply determined by economics. It also helps us think about what lies beyond the community or the nation, to the World Health Organization's idea of health being a right, not a privilege. This in itself doesn't necessarily build community resilience, but I developed from the sociologist Robert Bellah his idea of a good society, where he sees in the realm of healthcare a number of things that we need: more public debates, strong health education, active citizen involvement in long-term planning, access to community health, better health literacy in the media. I think all of these things will help us be more responsive to local needs, and can fill in the gaps left by state and private provision. I think if all of these things are in play, then communities are likely to be more prepared than we've seen in the sequence of health crises that I chart through the book.
Well, we certainly have plenty to learn from, that's for sure. And it's a well pointed out in this wonderful book, American Health Crisis, 100 Years of Panic, Planning, and Politics. Martin Halliwell is the author, also professor of American Studies at the University of Leicester, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Martin, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you, and all the best to you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Larry Sabato on the enduring hold of Donald Trump over today's GOP and the party's plan to retake the House in 2022.
Kevin McCarthy, Republican leader, takes the day off on Thursday to go to Bedminster, New Jersey, and sit down with former President Donald Trump. What does that tell you about the state of the GOP today?
It's still Trump's party. I don't know why anybody ever expected it to change. You know, there are various people, various factorums in the Republican Party who pop up on CNN and elsewhere telling us that Trump's influence is shrinking in the Republican Party. Where is that? I'm looking, I'm perfectly happy to see it happen, but it isn't happening. And what he was really doing was going to see, the crime boss. When the boss calls, you go. If you fear for your life otherwise. So he went through his agenda, and Trump said yes and no and yes and no. And I'll bet you any amount of money he ran through the possibilities for the select committee on January 6th, the insurrection. And Trump said yes, no. And he's going to get a committee on the Republican side of his liking. In other words, the crime boss was picking half the jury.
Yeah. Well, and clearly there was an agenda beyond just this January 6th committee. Wouldn't you agree that Kevin McCarthy sees that his path to taking back the House and maybe becoming Speaker in 2022 is loyalty to Donald Trump?
Yes, and of course, there's a little proviso there. Let's suppose the Republicans do take back the House. And of course, Kevin McCarthy is in line to become Speaker. Suppose Donald Trump, as he is wont to do, turns on him for some reason. Sometimes he turns on people just for the fun of it. I don't think Kevin McCarthy will be Speaker. Do you?
No, I don't. For a couple of reasons. That's one of them. And two, there are a lot of people out with sharp knives out for Kevin McCarthy in the Republican caucus still, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And beyond the Republican caucus, he's going to get, if he does become Speaker, he's going to have one of the most difficult speakerships in American history, because outside of that narrow band of Trump people in the caucus and outside the caucus, he is seen as public enemy number 2 or 3, but he's on the list.
So back to 2022, if the Republicans looking at 2022 are really making their case all about 2020, stolen election, illegitimate president, is that enough for them to win? Not just for House seats, Senate seats, gubernatorial seats. That seems to be their sole platform.
Well, in the House, of course, it's mainly about redistricting and reapportionment.
Right.
If you look at how that's being handled and how many big states they control, even though they don't win the statewide vote, they don't have to, because they got in the last redistricting what they wanted, and probably the momentum will carry them forward for the next 10 years. But they control the redrawing of the district. So between redistricting and reapportionment, right there, they'll probably be able to take over the House. It would be a miracle if Democrats retained it with this kind of minor margin coming up in the midterm of a Democratic presidency. No matter how successful the presidency is, the incumbent president almost always, not always, but almost always loses seats in the midterm. So is that their only platform? Well, it seems to be so far, and it's enough to stir the Trump people. They'll follow anything that Trump says, and as long as he stays on board and encourages them to show up and vote, they probably will.
But is it enough to also alienate the suburban voters that turned away from Republicans and Trump in 2020?
Well, it might be, but that's where turnout comes in.
Uh-huh.
You have to get people stirred up to vote in a midterm. And frankly, Republicans almost always turn out, and Democrats frequently, and you know this from your time at the party, frequently they are fair weather friends. And it takes an enormous amount of time and energy to convince Democrats that it's just as important to turn out in midterms or off-year elections like this one, as it is to turn out in presidential. So that's the challenge, Bill. And sometimes the party manages to do it, but most of the time it doesn't.
Right. They certainly didn't do it in Obama's midterms, right?
There you go. If anybody was going to excite the base, it would have been Obama. He did excite the base, but he didn't excite them enough to cause them to take an hour off on election day. Now, that's the change. We do have better laws that are being revoked in Republican states, but that still exist in Democratic states. So it's possible that the widespread use of mail balloting, which people liked in 2020, they liked it. It was convenient. Not just the pandemic, they liked the convenience of it. That may get the Democratic vote out sufficient to, if not hold the House, then make sure that Republicans don't get a massive majority.
So if the Republicans are running on, we got the election was stolen in 2020, Donald Trump's still our guy. This is in 2022. If they're running on that, what do Democrats run on? It looks to me like right now they want to run on, we got this done, if I can be blunt, right? We got the stimulus, we got the infrastructure, we got this $300 check for every kid in America. We got COVID behind us. There was a time, Larry, when accomplishments, right, getting stuff done was a winning message. Is it still?
Well, it can be, and they're going to have to use that because it is their best argument, and it happens to be true. that always helps. At least with the Democratic side of the electorate, it helps. I don't think truth matters that much anymore on the Trump side. But yeah, that's the argument that Biden has, in a sense, or in more than one sense, rescued us from the disasters of the Trump years and the projected disasters of a second term of Trump. That's a positive message. But you also have to add the negative part, which is if you let the Republicans get back in, they'll reverse every one of these changes at the first opportunity. Well, of course, Biden has the veto power, but it's a good argument because sometimes these massive bills get out of Congress and a president has to give thumbs up or thumbs down, even if he doesn't like a lot of the provisions in there. So it really is true. And you can give a positive and negative message that may be enough.
So if I read you correctly, you're saying that for the midterms, it's not inevitable that Republicans take back the House and the Senate, but likely.
Especially for the House. But it is not inevitable, but I would say they clearly have the lead at this point for lots of institutional reasons. The Senate, as always, is squirrely. It's so idiosyncratic. And you look at individual states and their races, and you can actually see a path for Democrats to gain seats. I'd have to say that the path for Republicans to gain seats is a little bit clearer right now, but it's not so clear that they're guaranteed to gain the Senate as well. So the House is tough. The Senate won't be easy, but if some chips fall the right way, they might be able to hold on to the 50-50 or even get a 51-49.
So with the crystal ball, have you made a prediction yet on either house, or are you just waiting to see?
You can't. How can you make a prediction when we don't even know what the districts are?
Correct. That's right.
We haven't had redistricting. Now on the Senate, we've got it essentially tied. We've got Democrats at 50, Republicans at 49 with one toss-up. You know which one it is? Pennsylvania, which has become one of the 4 or 5 most competitive states for everything in the country. So, and that's an open seat with Senator Toomey retiring.
Right. How do you politically now? How do you think Joe Biden is handling his new position as president of the United States?
Well, all the time I hear people say, "What's happening? What is he doing exactly?" They don't know the details because they're not paying close attention, and that in this case is actually a good thing. Everybody was exhausted after the 4 Trump years. You had to check in 10 times a day to see what crazy thing the guy had done lately.
Tell me about it.
And Biden is so, he's predictable, he's normal. And people say he's boring. I'll take boring. Boy, I've learned to value boring. So I think he's done well. I think he has accomplished more than people thought he was going to accomplish. And look at the thin margins in both the House and the Senate. And Democrats are famous for infighting. It's amazing that with 6 months in, they've actually more or less stayed together. Yes, the Manchin problem and so on, but by and large, they're united. Here's my beef with him. He is too reliant on his experience in the Senate that no longer exists. He was there for so many decades. He's convinced that he has the ability to bring Democrats and Republicans together. And back in that era, he did do that.
Yep.
And when he was elected, Delaware was very competitive. He had to appeal to some Republicans. So he was very good at going right down the middle and getting people from both sides. That era is over. You can't find more than a tiny number of Republicans who are even targets for your bills, to vote for your bills. So he hasn't fully adjusted to that. And he's playing that bipartisan game in an era where it doesn't exist.
And I'm curious as to your take on Biden's impact on the party, too, because, let's take the 2020 primary, right? There was all the noise was on the progressive side there for a long time, right? I mean, Bernie was going to win. Bernie's going to be the nominee. And moderate Joe Biden won. Same thing in New York. All the noise was with the progressives, that there was going to be the most progressive mayor ever in the history of the country. And Eric Adams won. Again, another moderate Democrat. Is this where the Democratic Party is going? Are they just sort of saying we got to be in the middle and pragmatic to win?
Well, that's what they're saying right now. We'll see.
Yeah.
They tend to forget quickly. But, really, Bill, you put your finger on something, because this is also a Trump effect that's not really discussed very much. It chilled the Democratic Party.
Interesting.
They remembered in 2016, and this is not to lay it all on Bernie by any means, but there were a lot of Bernie-crats who never came around to Hillary Clinton. And we got Donald Trump. And it reminded everybody of just how bad it can get. And so Democrats are enjoying being in charge. They're enjoying winning, but most of all, they're enjoying not having Donald Trump in office. He's still in our consciousness every single day, but he's not in office. He doesn't have the power to do the things that he wants to do. So I think it has moderated Democrats in some ways.
I'm sure you are watching, as I am, this a congressional race in Ohio where Nina Turner, big supporter of Bernie's, friend of mine, who led Bernie's Our Revolution after the 2016 campaign, is running for Congress with Bernie's support, and she's opposed by a Chantel Brown with James Clyburn's support. That's a real test again, right?
Well, it is a test, although in the end, does it matter very much? I mean, it's one congressional district. It's a guaranteed Democratic district. The winner of that district is going to vote with the other Democrats, especially because she'll be the most junior member of the House, and they generally don't make waves unless their name is AOC. So, yes, it's a test, and yet it isn't. Look at how Bernie has been treated by Biden. He's been treated very well, and Bernie respects Biden, and he likes the way he's been treated. That is where Biden's personal skills really are making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it also shows that pragmatic side of Bernie Sanders, which I know, but most people have not seen and don't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, absolutely. Look, he was the first to say, he wanted 5 to 6 trillion when it was 3.5 trillion. He said, this is terrific. Yeah, okay. Right. Well, that's the way it's supposed to be in Congress. You have to make compromises, and you should celebrate what you get, not whine about what you didn't get. Well, there he is. And he's the signal to all the other progressives to do the same thing.
Bill Press with Larry Sabato. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Nelson Lichtenstein, Martin Halliwell, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.